pals, I'm here today to talk about the 5 books I read in the month of May. This is a little bit delayed just because I've not really felt like filming lately, so apologies for that. But sometimes it's nice to just have a little filming break. So I only read 5 books in the month of May for a couple of reasons. One, I was just pretty busy. I had a couple of weekends away from home, and then the other weekends I was busy seeing family and friends. May is always a fairly busy month for me because it's my birthday, my mum's birthday, Johnny's sister's birthday, and just like ends up being quite busy with going out to celebrate birthdays. So that happened, and then also I DNF'd 9 books in the month of May, and in total that came to nearly 1,000 pages. So over a third of my reading in May in terms of like page count was books I gave up on, which is pretty shit. And I actually DNF'd 5 books in a row over the course of like 3 days. Each evening after work I try a couple of books and then like give up on them. And that was really demoralising. Made me start to think that maybe I was just really shit at choosing books that I thought I would like, or maybe reading just wasn't as great as I thought it was, and maybe like hardly any books reach that 5-star potential and most of them are just like mediocre. Maybe I don't even like read them that much. It was really shoddy. But then at the end of the month I purposely picked 2 books off my shelves. I was like, come on, I really think these have the potential to be 5 stars. And they both were, and then I've carried that on into the month of June and already read 2 more 5-star books. So it's all back in business, it's all okay, but yeah, it was a bit of a weird reading month. So I read 5 books. I'm going to start from my least favourite and work my way towards the 5-star reads. So the first one I read, and this was one I just got for my birthday, so it was a bit disappointing, was Mayflies by Andrew O'Hagan. I don't often read books by men, and when I do they tend to be non-fiction, so it's quite unusual for me to pick up a book by a man, and this is also about men. But I thought it sounded really interesting because this is focusing on a friendship over the course of a really long period. So this opens in 1986 and we follow a group of friends over one long weekend where they travel to Manchester to go to like a music festival. And we're following it all from one guy's perspective whose name I don't remember, but he's mainly focusing on describing his friend Tully Dawson. They're all in their like late teens. And then we jump forward 30 years, about halfway through the book, you're told this on the back, and he gets a phone call from Tully telling him that Tully has terminal cancer and hasn't got long left to live, and it's about how they deal with the grief of that, and they deal with sort of saying goodbye to one another. And so I thought that all sounded really interesting, and I really like books that look back on like childhood or like young adulthood, particularly when focused on friendship, so I thought I'll give it a go. I really didn't enjoy this book. And the reason I persisted with it, because I DNF books quite freely when I'm not enjoying them, as you can probably tell, is because I knew halfway through it was going to change to being from his perspective as an adult, and I thought maybe I'll find them less annoying when they're adults, and unfortunately I didn't. But by that point I was just so far through that I was like, I could just read this for another hour and a half and I'll finish it, so like I may as well. So I did. My issue with this was that there's sort of like 5 lads, I think, in their friendship group. They're all fairly intelligent, but they sort of know it. They drop a lot of like cultural references, political references from like the mid-80s period, a lot of which I didn't really pick up on. And I also just felt like they spent a lot of time getting really drunk, taking lots of drugs, which is absolutely fine, but then whilst high or drunk, having all these monologues like showing off about how intelligent or how funny they thought they were. And it's like when you're sober and someone else is drunk and they think everything they have to say is deeply fascinating, and it really isn't. It was like spending a weekend with 5 people like that. So I found them all incredibly annoying, and I kept thinking, oh, maybe they won't be so annoying when they're adults and maybe sober. They were just as annoying, but sort of older and middle class, and yeah, I just found them all fairly insufferable. Spent the whole novel just thinking everything I had to say was really hilarious when it wasn't that funny. So yeah, this didn't work for me. Interestingly, I had a look to see if the author had any other books out, because I'd never heard of him prior to this book, and he has, but all of his other novels have really low ratings on Goodreads. So I feel like maybe in general, like, his writing style isn't universally loved, but because this was about a really difficult topic, and I do think the topic it delves into in the second half, which I don't really want to spoil, but maybe look up content warnings because it is quite a difficult topic. I think that was handled pretty well, and I think that's what a lot of people took away from this, but I just couldn't see past not really liking the characters and finding everyone pretty insufferable when you weren't really supposed to. So yeah, didn't work for me. I gave this one 2 stars. Then I read the new Emily Henry book called Book Lovers, and I read this one on my e-reader. I've read all 3 of Emily Henry's sort of recent romance releases, and my favourite one is, I can't remember what the UK title is, but in the US it's called People Meet on Vacation. I thought that was the best one of the 3. I'd maybe put this one in the middle, and the reason for that is that I enjoy her romances, right? This is like a 3-star read for me. I think they're fine. I give most romances 3 stars when I read them. I do really enjoy the process of like binge reading a book within 24 hours, which is what I can do with most romance books. So that's really nice. What I found I preferred about this one over the other 2 romance books she's written is that I've noticed Emily Henry has this thing where she gives both of the romantic leads quite, or things they view in their past as traumatic. But in her previous 2 romances, the men have had significantly, I think, more traumatic things to deal with. But the woman has been the one who's portrayed as like having this really difficult thing to overcome, and the guy ends up like spending a lot of time like lifting her up and comforting her. Like, for example, in the previous one, which I actually really enjoyed, the thing I didn't like about it was that the guy had lost his mother when he was quite young, and he was the oldest of 3 sons, and so he ended up sort of co-parenting his brothers with his dad, and they had a really difficult life. They just couldn't get over the loss of her, and that was like his backstory, and her backstory was that she didn't really ever feel like she properly fit in at high school, and I just don't really think those 2 things are comparable, but it was treated like he needed to comfort her more, and I found that quite difficult. So what I thought was handled better in this one is that in this one, the woman, her mother had died several years before, or when she was young, I think, and she had to raise her sister, and I thought that was dealt with quite well, and so the sort of balance of sympathy, if you will, between the 2 made sense, whereas I think in previous books, just because she perhaps thinks that like the man should be the protector in the relationship, they were inhabiting that role, even though in the dynamic between the 2 it didn't really make sense, and that didn't sit well with me. So I think in that regard this one was better, but you know, still like a 3-star read for me. Then I listened to Growing Up African in Australia on audiobook. This one is an essay collection edited by Maxine, Beneba, Clarke. This has, I think, around 40 essays in. This is the 3rd of these I've listened to. I think there's maybe 5. So I've listened to Growing Up Aboriginal in Australia, Growing Up Disabled in Australia, and now Growing Up African in Australia. And they're all really great. I highly recommend them. I've given all 3 of them 4 stars. And the reason these don't reach like 5-star potential for me is because they are from loads of different voices, and when I read collections of essays or short story collections like that, it's really hard for me to give them 5 stars because inevitably there's just going to be some voices that don't work as much for you as a reader, and for me, I'm not a massive fan of poetry, and all of these collections include some poetry, and I just found whenever I get the poems or the songs or anything, I'm a bit like, okay, like fine. But other than that, I really enjoy these collections. I think what they're really good at is within the group they're focusing on, choosing a great selection of diverse voices. So for example, in the Growing Up African in Australia, we had people who were born in Australia, people who moved to Australia for different reasons. So some people who moved there as refugees, some people who moved there because of their parents' work, or like maybe some of them, someone in their family had died and that led to them having to move to Australia. And they also just focused on different topics. Some of them focused on their childhood, some of them focused on like their university years or them being much older. And I just think there's a really great selection of voices. Something I find in all these collections, and this is not a criticism, this is just something to be aware of if you're not Australian, I think, or just not that culturally aware about Australian like people, I guess, is that I think quite a few of these people in these collections are like famous dancers or like sports people or musicians, and I rarely recognise their names because like I'm pretty shit with like British culture in that regard, let alone any other country's culture. So like when I read these stories, I read them simply for like the words on the page, whereas I think if you are Australian or you have a better understanding of like famous Australian people, then you would read some of these and be like, oh, that's so and so, it's really interesting to hear their thoughts on this. So I think you could maybe just get a little bit more from it, but I still think these are really great collections and I highly recommend them on audio. This had, I think, 6 or 7 different audio narrators and I listened to it on Scribd, so if you have Scribd you can get over there. The first 5-star read I had in May was Girlhood by Febos. This is a collection of essays that lean towards the personal. She's got 2 previous books out. I definitely want to go read both of them because this was phenomenal. I don't know if I'm going to do a good job at articulating why I love this so much, but just please go and read this if any of this sounds remotely interesting to you. The premise of this is that the author is looking at what it means to grow up in a body that society perceives as feminine and the constructs that are put around you because of that, and how it's really difficult, even if you have really open and sort of informative parents who are willing to talk about things like sex and consent and pleasure, how it's still really hard to not be formed as a young girl as somebody who doesn't have the ability to give consent and has to accept the male gaze and is really limited in the way in which she can view herself and in admitting that she feels sexual pleasure. So this is an excellent collection. The first couple of essays are more focused on her childhood, and they're the ones that I think lean more towards memoir. They're incredibly beautifully written. I really love reading books about particularly girlhood, but I enjoyed reading books just about childhood and adolescence. I think looking back on that sort of nostalgic time period through the eyes of an adult is really interesting, and she does that absolutely beautifully. Like, she just writes wonderfully. There is a lot of difficult content in this book. The author's very upfront about the fact that she developed physically at a very young age. Around 11 she was already very curvaceous, and it happened so quickly that she wasn't prepared and her parents weren't prepared for the way in which boys and men started to act towards her. And because of that, none of those conversations at home had happened, and she didn't realise that she had the ability to say no to any of these things. So a lot of quite awful things happened to her as a young girl, which she's upfront about. And then as we get more into her years as a sort of woman in her early 20s, there is an essay, for example, on the idea of the peeping Tom. She talks about a personal experience she had when she was growing up in a ground floor apartment in New York, and in the daytime people could see in, but at night time she had blackout curtains. But one night a man started standing outside the windows and saying really horrific, vulgar stuff through the windows. And when she went to the police, there's like, look, there's pretty much nothing we can do unless he does something more than what he's doing. And she pulls in loads of analysis of like films in the second half of the 20th century and how these sort of peeping Toms or these sort of voyeuristic stalkers were romanticised and actually became the romantic lead of these films, and how that was a reflection of the way society viewed these men, and how it becomes something that women just have to accept. It's like, you know that you're going to be watched, you know that these things are going to happen, and so if they do, well, you know, you can't really complain about them that much. She is really brilliant at pulling all this analysis together, and what I loved about this collection is I felt it really pushed me. Like, there was a lot of points where I had to like reread sentences or paragraphs to make sure I was following exactly what she was trying to articulate, which is something I really like. I like to be pushed by a collection. There is an essay in here towards the end about consent, specifically focuses on consent, and she talks about something she went to called a cuddle party, which is where you pay like $25 and you go and you're all sort of fully clothed in like sleepwear, and there's not allowed to be any sort of sexual contact or dialogue, and the premise is that it's for people, mainly people who are lacking in physical contact and feel really lonely and just want to like be held in a completely platonic way. And you always have to ask for consent to touch somebody. So you sort of introduce yourself to one another and say, like, would you like a hug? And they encourage people to say no if they don't want to. And the person who they've sort of declined is supposed to say, thank you for taking care of yourself. And it's about the fact that she goes to one of these cuddle parties and realises that they're predominantly men, and lots of men come up to her and she doesn't feel like she wants to cuddle them, and she does feel like there's some sort of sexual undertone to it, but she doesn't feel like she has the ability to say no. when she leaves and talks to her partner about it, they have this discussion, and the author's bisexual, and she's currently in a long-term relationship with a queer woman, which is something she discusses, which I also found really interesting. I'll talk about in a second. Her partner says, I think you should think about why you feel this inability to say no to these men, and I think we should go back. And that is something that happens at the end of the essay, and that's really deeply explored. But one of the things she says about being in a relationship with this woman, and having been in a relationship in the past with both men and women, is that whenever she's in a relationship with a man, she's expected to be mother, lover, carer and counsellor, and when she's in a relationship with a woman, she's only expected to be the lover. And that men are raised to, without even realising they're doing it, just to take, and to feel like women owe them sort of sympathy and pity and things like caregiving, and at these cuddle parties, like if a woman says no, the man's immediately offended because it felt like it was a foregone conclusion that physical contact was going to happen. It's just, I don't know if I'm doing this any justice. Absolutely brilliant. Like all of these, I could go to any of these tabs, and they're all excellent. So this one is about the peeping Tom. It's called Intrusions. This may be the longest effect of a lifetime of being looked at, being told that it is a duty, a compliment, even a source of power. It has eroded my sense of entitlement to privacy. I should never not be thinking of the man who might be watching me, even alone in my bedroom. I should not and cannot refuse a gaze through a window, a neighbour with a camera, a closely following stranger, a comment on the street. How different is a gaze from a hand after all. What a powerful message it is that your body ought to be available to any man passing by. It will only inconvenience you to protest. Better to tolerate it, reframe it as nothing memorable, as a joke, as journalism, as privilege, even as a precursor to love. That's just literally a random tab I flick to. They're all that amazing, so yeah, 100% recommend that you pick this one up. And then lastly we have a short story collection, and that is Seeking Fortune Elsewhere by Sindya, Bhanoo. And I nearly didn't buy this one because I didn't like the cover. I thought it was a little bit too saccharine, and I'm so glad I did pick it up because this collection is nothing of the sort. It is absolutely wonderful. And I really think this could be the sort of collection that if you're someone who doesn't think they enjoy short stories or isn't sure if they can enjoy something in so short a form, this would be a really great one to pick up, because all of these to me feel perfectly formed. They feel like they don't need to be any longer or any shorter. And they made me think of, don't know if anyone remembers these, I mean they're probably still a thing, those my nan used to have these glass sort of stones or baubles, and they'd have blown glass inside of all different colours, and you could turn them around in the light and they'd look different, but at each angle there'd be something sort of fascinating to look at. Reminds me of these, just these perfectly formed blown glass spheres. So yeah, I love this. The premise of this is it focuses on South Indian people, both who still live in South India and who have moved to different parts of the world. Primarily this focuses on, all bar I think one story, focuses on women, and predominantly focuses on the power they hold, or the power they choose or sort of feel forced to surrender. And the word I'd use to describe this is tender. It's exquisitely tender, very warm-hearted, really gracious, and that makes it sound like it might be a bit saccharine, but it really isn't. This is just incredibly, every story I sort of read and at the end just paused and just thought it's so sad but yet so wonderful, and yeah, just filled with beauty. So I absolutely love this. I'll give you a few examples of the stories in here. And the first story in the collection is about an elderly widowed lady who lives in a quite fancy care home in South India, and the story opens with her seeing one of the other elderly residents die of, I think, a heart attack in front of her, and it makes all the residents start to discuss why they're there and why they're not living with their children, because in South Indian culture it's very normal for elderly people to be cared for in the home by their children. And it starts all these discussions that are quite filled with pride, and also sort of secrets, because they all feel quite ashamed that their children aren't caring for them in the home, but yet also sometimes feel that they can brag and say, well, my child's doing this amazing thing in Australia or this amazing thing in America, and I'm not there because I like it here and I don't want to move country. And it sparks all these discussions, and it's just really beautiful, and I loved it. There is another story in here called Nature Exchange, which is about a woman whose young son is killed, I think in a school shooting, very tragically. And prior to his death, he loved going to this local natural history museum where you could do something called a nature exchange. So he'd take in things like seashells or pine cones and get given a certain amount of points based on like how rare the thing he was taking in was. And then they save those points on the system for you, and he was saving up to buy the most expensive thing in the Natural History Museum, which I think was worth like 20,000 points, that was a set of antlers. And after his death, his mother becomes obsessed with still saving up his points for those antlers, and she keeps going in day after day, and eventually starts to buy really expensive things online that she knows will get loads of points. And it's about what that does to her marriage and how her and her husband are trying to grieve and sort of move on differently. It's absolutely heartbreaking, just beautifully written. Another one of the stories in here is about a mother who is going to one of her sort of estranged daughter's weddings, and it's about the fact that they were raising their daughters in America. Her husband just said, like, I don't love you, I want a divorce, when their children were quite young, and she decided that rather than sort of raise her daughters in shame by her living nearby and like the whole local South Indian community seeing them be like you know, children who were moved between their houses at weekends and stuff, she would move to another state. And she's sort of looking back on the fact that she made that decision thinking it was the right thing for them, and how on the wedding day it's very clear that the way they view their father compared to her is drastically different, and perhaps she made the wrong decision, and it's just filled with regret, and I felt so much sadness and compassion for her, and I just absolutely love this. Yeah, I'd highly recommend. I'll pick up anything this author writes. I'd love to see any novels she brings out, but equally I really love this collection, so would love to see more people pick it up, and just think that this is one that could be really adored, and I think if enough people picked it up, then I think loads of people could be talking about it. This is from Catapult, they're quite a small indie press in the US, so I hope enough people pick it up to give it the buzz it deserves, because this was just amazing. So yeah, those are the 5 books I read in the month of May. I'd love to know if you've read any of them, and if so, what your thoughts were. I can hear there's been some birds sitting on my chimney the whole time I've been doing this, so if you've just been able to hear birds twittering away constantly, then I hope you found that nice and not annoying. Yeah, and I will see you in the next video. Thanks, bye.